kidding, I'm a nice person. Hello. I'm just standing like this. That man even sweated. Oh my gosh. Are you having fun? You're having fun with that? Come on. How do you have fun in a place like this? Exactly. Oh my God, our name almost matched. Oh, you got to know that. Oh, you used to get your name. I've been looking at it. Huh? Oh, no. I'll see you. Don't miss us tonight.
Already? Good evening. Good evening. Still testing? Yeah. So many signs to a function. Sound, screen, everything. Fantastic. Thank you so much. 30:30. We made it. Brilliant. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant. Welcome everybody to our theme today as part of our Africa Month celebrations. My name is Thabang Moleko. More important. There are people here that you're here to see. And thank you for you arriving so much. Our theme today is an exploration around the concepts of justice and reparations. And, you know, what we're expecting our panel to look at is how do we look at reparatory justice, what it means, why it starts, how it talks about us having meaningful transitions and transformations in Africa today. Of course, we recognize that this is something about pain, and collectively, individually, it's a lot of pain to our people. And we know we suffered slavery, colonialism, apartheid, and even genocide. So we want to see what are Africa's injustices that have occurred, and link them possibly to some other global struggles that are occurring, and look at what can we do about indigenous peoples in our land, and how we treat them, and how do we deal with these matters in a fair, equitable, and just manner within the ethics that we want to possess. But I will call upon our Vice-Chancellor, Dr. Mabizela, to outline the event for today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Group and Director. I take it that when you talk about genocide, you mean real, not imagined.
Not really now.
Thank you very much. Honored guests, see the Director of Finance with Literature Museum, Sana, very welcome to you. With Sana, this is for me. Thank you very much. Colleagues, colleagues and friends. On behalf of the Rhodes University community, I take great delight in welcoming you to this Africa Day panel discussion themed an exploration of the concepts of justice and reparations. We offer our sincere gratitude to our eminent panelists who have graciously agreed to share their insights on this evening's topic of discussion. Our appreciation extends to the Director and staff of the Division of Global Engagement for organizing this evening's panel discussion and all the other events to commemorate the 62nd anniversary of the founding of the Organization of African Unity, now known as the African Union. Yesterday, we joined all Africans in the rest of our continent and in the diaspora to celebrate the founding of the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, on the 25th of May, 1963. 62 years ago, leaders of 30 of the 32 independent African states signed a founding charter of the OAU. From its inception, the OAU was established to free all Africans and the ignominious system, free all Africans from colonial oppression and the ignominious system of apartheid, and to ensure that Africans join hands in confronting common developmental challenges facing the continent. As we celebrate the 62nd anniversary of the founding of our continental body, we must pay homage to our forebears who fought gallantly to free our continent and its people from the clutches of colonialism, slavery, and apartheid. We must also renew our commitment and rededicate ourselves to the advancement of their vision of an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa. We must speak out against Afrophobia, which manifests itself on our university campuses, when academics and other professionals from the rest of the African continent are treated with suspicion, subjected to exclusionary practices, or denied the recognition and respect they rightfully deserve. Given the historical injustices and the enduring legacies of colonialism, slavery, and apartheid, and the continued exploitation of Africans and people of African descent, it is both timely and appropriate that this evening's discussion should focus on the issue of reparations as a form of justice. The ongoing plundering of the natural resources, undermining of freedom, and the persistence of social and economic inequalities for Africans and people of African descent underscores the urgent need to address the enduring injustices of the past, which continue to shape the present. Of course, reparations need not be of a financial nature. As part of meaningful reparations, erstwhile colonial powers should commit to sustained investment in education, in infrastructure, in economic development, and other initiatives aimed at restoring the dignity and affirming the humanity of Africans and people of African descent. Acknowledging the full scope of historical wrongs and investing in meaningful redress Reparations can help dismantle structural inequalities, restore dignity, and empower communities to build a more equitable, a sustainable, and an inclusive future. Again, a very warm welcome to you all. Asante sana. Zikomo kwambiri ndatenda nkosi kyalibuwa nyabonga merci beaucoup kyalibuwa nyachogoza obrigado. Thank you very much.
Thank you, VC. I think it is quite interesting that we're sort of seeing an attack now on our international values. I won't even talk about the chaos in Harvard. I want to talk about here at home, where they're starting to question, why do we even have international faculty? You know, you're starting to realize that this is concerted, it's an effort, and I think initiatives like this show us that we're still resisting. And on that note, I'd like to call upon our Director, Global Engagement. She will set the contextualization for the month. Thanks, Paula.
Thank you. Good evening. Am I using this? Okay, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me? Thank you very much for coming out. It's a kind of cold, dark night, so I really appreciate everyone who ventured out. And we are on our first day of exams on campus today, so you can feel the tension in the air with all the students. But I think it was very important to try and just mark Africa Day on our campus, particularly at this time. So I'm the Director of Global Engagement, and I can tell you it's a dizzying time to be in charge of global engagement. All the rules seem to be up in the air. I'm finding that we're increasingly looking at safety and security when anyone wants to move anywhere. So things have really changed, and there is quite a turbulent climate at the moment. And I think that while we are all getting these images of chaos in many parts of the world, I mean, like we've been following what is happening in the US, what is happening in the Middle East between Israel and Gaza, what is happening between India and Pakistan, what is happening in West Africa. I mean, it's like all the things we thought were the givens of international relations and international humanitarian law and international protocols really have all been thrown up in the air. So while we're seeing these scenes of really terrible misleadership and chaos in many places, we're also seeing great examples of human solidarity. And one of the things that I really wanted to try and emphasize during this Africa Month was to create spaces, particularly for all our colleagues and students from the continent, to engage with each other at the human level. Because you will find that when you get people together who appear to be so different to each other, we all have many of the same interests at heart, and we all value the same things as human beings. We all want to be safe and secure, we want to have food in our bellies, we want to have a place to sleep at night, we want to live in harmony with our neighbours, and many of us all have the exact same aspirations. But there are forces that really divide people and create fear among people, and that leads to lack of willingness and courage to engage with each other. So small things we did on campus. We had an open mic, and what is very interesting is, given the space to pick what you want to talk about, the theme was Africans Who Shaped Me. I want to give a big shout out to African mothers. You were the primary shaping force and the person in most of our open mic participants that they picked as the most important person in their life. So sometimes we see stereotypes of downtrodden African women, but I can tell you when you engage with people individually, African women are so strong, so much the rock, the bedrock of so many people's lives, that again, this is what we need to be talking about, you know? So I just wanted to say that we need to create more of these spaces. Another space we created was at the library wall. We did a mural with the theme of the African Union theme, and we invited students, and these weren't just the politics and international studies students, they were pharmacy students, science students, and we said, what do you think of this theme? What does this mean to you? And what do you think are the way forward? And the diversity of individual thought that is now up on that wall, I really invite you to go and look at the thoughts people shared. And there were so many surprising things up there. Like, you know, as a way forward, someone put down mindfulness. I mean, in our discussion about reparations and justice, we can very often get into very much political discussions, but there was this idea of spirituality, of, you know, apologizing, of acknowledging, and some of that was just at the interpersonal level. So I think sometimes certain topics we restrict to the global political situation, but actually what we need to do is bring it down into some of our interpersonal relationships. So I'm Irish, you might have guessed from my accent. So one of the things that I just wanted to make the point about here as well was genocide, apartheid, slavery have not just been applied to the African continent. Right now, in the contemporary world, there is more human trafficking right now in 2025 than there was at any other period in history. You have got, I just visited Rwanda about a month ago, and I went to visit the Genocide Memorial, and they have on their wall multiple other genocides as well as what happened in Rwanda, including Cambodia, where I actually previously worked years ago. And I don't know if many of you remember, I mean, Cambodia was referred to as the killing fields. And there was an experiment where they tried to reset everything back to year zero. It was a failed experiment, but millions of people died. We've got the situations of just multiple histories. For example, in Ireland, we were the first experiment of colonialism. I don't know if many of you know this. And Professor Kwesi Prague, who recently got his honorary doctorate, told me I had an obligation to share this with the students of today. So I'm sharing it with you. And I mean, we suffered under the penal laws, which literally banned the language, banned the religion. And I don't know if many of you know the English expression that something is beyond the pale. So the Pale was a nice secluded area of rich land around the main city, where basically the settlers would stay within, and beyond the Pale was where you sent all the Irish to the poor land, off into the west, where they couldn't farm. 1847, we had a potato famine, which you may know. Interestingly, the potato originated in Peru, not in Ireland, but we became dependent on it. And when there was a failed crop, again, a new, or something I discovered much later in life, is very often famine is not because of shortage of food. It's because of shortage of food to a certain group of people at a certain group of time. But there is food available within the country. It's just it's not available to that group. And that was the situation with the Irish famine. So we were still exporting things abroad, food abroad. And this idea of global relationships. There is a Native American group, the Choctaw, were one of the first people to send aid to the Irish. And they themselves had just been dispossessed of all their land in the States. So I urge people to not get caught up in this idea that we cannot all have human solidarity and internationalism, because my worry is you then get into these ideas of exceptionalism. And I don't believe that is a good place to begin to open ourselves to developing a more humanizing approach to life. Because right now we're seeing dehumanization in many parts of the world. I include Sudan, I include Congo. I mean, there are so many disputes and conflicts going on all over the place. It's impossible to go through them all, and quite overwhelming, actually. But I just would urge people that while tonight we're going to focus on the African context and some of the work that our panelists are doing, in general, let's remember we live on one planet. We are all interconnected. We are all subject to climate change. We're increasingly subjected to a global economy that influences all of what we're doing. And the very first event we had was a public lecture here with Logan Wirt, who has been working on tax on the African continent. And he said one of the big issues is that most African countries have signed away their tax rights. So when there is bilateral relationships, Africa is not benefiting from the tax, but other countries are in the north. The digital economy, all of the Africans are using their money to pay for Netflix, Uber, Airbnb, whatever else is going on, but none of that money is staying in Africa, and it's not being taxed in Africa. So he urged us, while the theme is very important, he said, pay attention to the current statistics, the current facts and figures, and he said, no one's coming to save Africa, but it can save itself once it starts looking at all these opportunities, looking at what is here, and finding new ways to think about the richness of this continent. So that is my few thoughts for the evening to just set the tone, and I think we're going to go into more Africa-specific discussion for the rest of the evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think we get here and come to what we came here for, to hear these really illustrious and accomplished speakers just present to us on some of their thoughts on justice and reparations. I think they're definitely starting up with. I've got Professor Rhodes Rasool. He's a PhD scholar. He's a PhD and senior professor in historical studies at the University of Western Cape, and he is the director of the African program in Museum and Heritage Studies, widely published on changing old museums and making them new, talking about race in museums, restitution and political movements, and also the politics of non-racialism. He has served on the boards of District 6 Museum, Isiko Museum of South Africa, and is a member of the South African National Advisory Board for the restitution of reparations. He's a principal investigator on the International Collaborative Research Project, Reconnecting Objects, Epistemolarity, and Transformative Practices. He really is, he's currently now a member of the Scientific Advisory Board for the study of, tech is really pleasing today, for the study of the Von Luschen collection at the Staatliche Museum Zu-Berlin, Germany. We've got Professor Shahid Fawad. Did you get that? Yeah. All right. Currently, he's the Hugh LeMay Research Fellow at the History Department here at Rhodes University. He also holds research positions at the University of Witwatersrand in Cape Town. He has led departments and schools at the University of Durban, Westville, Witwatersrand, and Cape Town, and was the first Archie Mafeja Chair in Critical Humanities at the University of Cape Town. He has participated in various committees in the International Council of Museums Committee. He is one of the lead researchers in the project of modern heritage in Africa, participating in UNESCO panels related to heritage, and serves on various editorial boards of journals of African studies and curates and the Springer series on creativity, heritage, and in the city. And he also does research on state building in Africa, Afro-Asia, and modern heritage. Of course, we've also got Professor Pedro Tabinsky. He's born in Santiago, Chile, to refugee parents. His mother was a Holocaust survivor. We managed to, in Hungary, 2 weeks before the final stage or the final solution was implemented. His father is of Polish Jewry ancestry and is a refugee of the Chinese Revolution. That's interesting. Prof. Tabinsky has lived a peripatetic life since the age of 3, ending up in South Africa in 2001, and of course meeting his wife, with whom he has 2 lovely children. He's the founding director of the Alan Gray Center for Leadership Ethics, and he's in the Department of Philosophy, Rhodes University. He's an author of Happiness Personified, Personal Community and Purpose, and of several articles and book chapters. He's also the editor and contributor to Judging and Understanding, essays on free will, narrative meaning, and the ethical limits of condemnation. So one of the things that also really has a focus on some publications on Fanon and Camus on the Algerian questions, Ethics of Rebellion, and he's currently completing a book titled Ethics and Education as Practice of Freedom, and he's expecting it to come out, quoting the book on arts education, expecting it in 2026. Can I call upon my esteemed panel to present? I think we're going to start.
Thank you so much, Abang. It's really a great pleasure to be here in Makanga with you. Thanks very much to the Office of International Global and it's just wonderful to see lots of old colleagues, friends, comrades amongst us. Shepard Marty, Julie Wells, Alan Kilculny, and my dear friends from Cape Town, Leslie Witz and Josie Frater. And it's just so good to see all of you. And just to follow on from all that, I can't help but mention that in 1890, Alfred Court Haddon, the anthropologist, recommended to Trinity College Dublin that graves in a churchyard in Innisboffin, in the far west of Ireland, be taken from their graves to be brought into the university for racial study by the British. It was the very same Alfred Court Haddon who presented a lecture at the joint conference of the South African and British Associations for the Advancement of Science, recommended that the bodies of what he called those fast disappearing races be urgently studied, which led not just to the caste-making project in the then South African Museum, but also led to the voracious collection of the remains of the dead, which entered South African museums through trade with grave robbers. And that is the history of the assembly of the remains of South African people as part of our internal colonialism. And it happened at this time not because it happened at a time when South Africa was becoming a nation. And so the South Africans intervened to prevent Europeans from acquiring these remains from the robbers. And so you had a process of the scientization of South Africa, of the South African formation of science at this time, based on the dead Khoisan body. And this was a voracious trade and a collecting history that my late colleague Martin Legassic and I wrote about in Skeletons in the Cupboard, that led to the return of the remains of Klaas and Troy Pinnaker in 2012 and their reburial at Kulma. And what I'm going to talk to you about today is an aspect of what we can think of as reparatory work. Because I like to think of reparations not just as quantum and financial payout, but as cultural work, as epistemic work, as political work of social restoration. Because we need to be doing a long-term project of social restoration. Now, we can talk quantum, financial payout. Give me the money. I want it now. We can do that. And there are many examples, not many, there are few examples that we can already refer to. We can refer to the case of the people who were incarcerated in concentration camps in Kenya during Mau Mau, who successfully claimed money from the British government, out of which emerged what we call the displaced archives of the last decade of colonialism in different British colonies, where we can tell quite a great deal about the extent of British violence in their former colonies on the eve of independence. We also have a wonderful example that you can go online and look up immediately in extensive detail of the Legacies of Slavery project, largely done at University College London, led by a number of colleagues, including by Catherine Hall, the historian and a partner of the late Stuart Hall, whose theorization of many things lives with us and guides us in many ways. And that research project uncovered an archival collection of the Compensation Commission. Because as slavery in the British world was coming to an end and was being planned for, whose end was being planned for in 1834 in the Caribbean, in Mauritius and South Africa, the British government took out a massive loan with which they paid out the former owners of enslaved people who were going to lose their property. And that archival collection enables you to calculate in great detail how much money was given to families who you can name. We haven't done that work yet in the Cape. We have not done that work of which owners of enslaved people got what amounts of money and what kinds of beneficiation did it create. How did it lead to the formation of education institutions? And you can work out, you can do the maths on which education institutions were created at that time. How did it lead to the creation of banking institutions and insurance bodies? You go to just something innocuous like the Board of Executors and you look, when was it formed? And you see 1834. Founded 1834. Accidentally, coincidentally, or what? So, if you want to talk quantum, we can do quantum. But I want to put to you a different agenda. And that is an agenda of social restoration that takes its cue from the discussions and the work done in a committee in the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that spoke about symbolic reparations. What is the work of symbolic reparations? What is the work in heritage, memory? How do we historicize? How do we remake ourselves as humans in the aftermath of apartheid and colonialism? So, and I want to put to you that the work of restitution is fundamental to our healing and to our restoration. This is the return of the remains of our liberation fighters. And here I'm also mindful of the ways in which Freedom Park has chosen to divide South African history into different themes and different periods and different formations of violence. And I want to say that you will have heard, you would have followed the recent events of the return of anti-apartheid heroes and fighters, very much within the kind of heroic pantheon understanding of resistance. And I also want to say that we have an opportunity to return the remains of our ancestors whose dead bodies were collected from the colonial battlefields in the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu. And we have the opportunity to return the remains of our ancestors whose bodies were collected for the purposes of race and which lie in museums across Europe. I have been working in Germany. I have been working with different museums and different regional governments and with the national government. And I can tell you, they have remains of South African people. Our government thinks that this is a Khoisan problem. We associate it with the Khoisan because South African history has this peculiarity of Khoisan people being colonized through the discipline of race. And people from Bantu-speaking communities colonized through social anthropology and through the idea of tribe, through indirect rule. So these are legacies of colonialism that we have to deal with. And so to bring to the attention of everybody that this is not just a Khoisan question. This is a question of all South Africans whose remains lie in the museums of Europe. Now, because of the Holocaust history of Europe, of the history of the violence of the Holocaust, Germans came to understand that it is not appropriate for their museums to hold the dead for the purposes of racial study any longer. It took maybe 2 or 3 years of discussion in the advisory board of the Lushan collection in Berlin to convince them of that. Because originally, they thought the task was to balance the interests of science with the interests of community. There is no scientific value in doing research on the dead whose bodies have been assembled unethically and for the purposes of racial study. None at all. And they eventually understood that. The trouble that we have right now, at this moment of return, is that we have a contest taking place. And it is very important that you understand the distinction between repatriation and restitution. This is something that I'm now arguing to people. We used to think that these were the same thing. They were just synonyms. We talk about repatriation in Australia and New Zealand, and we talk about it in North America, Canada and the United States, because in those societies there is a problem of sovereignty between indigenous people and their national governments. So a repatriation is a shifting of sovereignty. But in these discussions it is emerging that repatriation refers to the process, the project of giving, whereas restitution refers to the project of demanding. And you have a contest between repatriation and restitution that governs these processes, in which the Germans, for example, want to do repatriation as quickly as possible, what they refer to as Rückgabe, and which the Dutch are now following suit and referring to it as Teruggabe. Whereas we tell them, you have a much better word, because we speak a colonial version of their language, a Creole version of their language. We can teach them. You have a much better word. You have terugbezorgen. Terugbezorgen, with a more care. And what would happen if you do zorg, if you do care? The other thing that is happening that's a problem in this field is that the Europeans want to do returns within their museum classificatory system. So they understand that it's unethical for them to hold the dead, that they can grasp. But because all of the major concepts of anthropology were generated by colonialism in Oceania and the Pacific, which generated a colonialism without anti-colonial violence and resistance, resulting in a concept of anthropology being humane, that we receive these collections because they were a gift, or that we can do work with each other through co-curatorship, or that these collections now belong to all of us. They are entangled. These are concepts, kind of liberal concepts that have emerged. And we need to really think about how important it is to depart from the classificatory system, because we have learned that the material culture, the belongings that entered museums through processes of objectification. Object is a museum professional concept of governance. So when you do restitution, you do the work of de-objectification. And you also do the work of de-ethnologization, because you've got to remove the belonging from its museum governance. And let me take this opportunity to recognize the work done in Iziko Museums of South Africa, to recognize the work that they did in doing what they referred to as de-accessioning. There was no Afrikaans word for de-accession. We had to invent an Afrikaans word for de-accession. We called it ontboek, to take it out of the book. Iziko Museums went through an investigation of their collection, and they decided which of the ancestors entered their museum unethically. And they took it out of their book, took them out of their book, and placed them in a special zone to be ready for the work of restitution as social restoration. Because these are not events. You know, government operates through events management. They think a restitution is a singular event of return that takes place through a celebration in a government garden. That is not, that is where the work starts. That we need to do the work. Restitution is restorative work. This is the work that is also reparatory. It is a process of social repair. This this could be a magnificent program for the African Union. What it needs is the work of government. There are legal, diplomatic, political components to this work. But there are also components that have to be driven by activists. We need to be able to develop our claims-making abilities and claims-making mechanisms, because we cannot let returns happen on the terms of the former colonizers. It is very important that African-led projects of restitution and restoration be fostered. And that means we have to think outside of bureaucracy. We need to think as much as we need policy, bureaucracy, political processes, diplomacy, law. We also need social restoration. Thank you very much.
And funny enough, I love museums. I didn't realize they were a crime scene. Thanks for that, Professor. I think it's going to be quite good for us to touch on and move on further. I think Prof. Shahid presents. Save your questions. I hope the pens are being there furiously. We'll give you some time to engage.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you to Professor Mabindela and to Ola for inviting me, and to my panel here. I'm going to talk about what I've just talked, repatriation and reparation. And I'm so glad that Siraj has actually clarified the difference between the two, so I don't have to do that very much. I just do want to mention that I was trained as an anthropologist, and we've gone through a lot of this process that Siraj just talks about, and I do think history has to do exactly the same thing. And what raises an important question that I will come to later, and that is, how do we begin to think of the university in a different form of how knowledge is used? And so I'll talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to talk about this issue around reparations and restitutions insofar as it has happened in South Africa with various examples. I'm not going to talk too much about human remains, because there are other, Siraj has already covered some of that, or he's covered a lot of it actually. I'm going to talk about some of the other kinds of things that have happened over the last 30 years. But I want to talk a little, to begin with, to talk about how this is currently framed. And it's currently framed in terms of what is now known as the Savoir report. It was published around 2018, and I think in 2019 the English version came out. And it makes it very clear. The objects, whether they're human remains or other cultural and historical objects that have been collected over the years, is directly related to colonialism. And they make the point. These are illegitimately collected, whether they were collected because the people were missionaries here and traded with it, or they were given as gifts, or whether it was, as I will talk a little bit later about the Egyptian mummy in the Durban Museum, through basically war. And of course, the Savoir report recognizes the value of the Sarabhatman return. And that asks the question, is this the model? There are, of course, lots of other documents. There's the 1970 UNESCO Convention on the prohibition of illicit import and export of cultural objects. But African countries have been knocking on that door fruitlessly for decades. So it doesn't work. But it's important that some of the legislation that Siraj has talked about that exists in this country have been used by the current state as a form of how they do reparations and restitutions, and how they do it in relation to South Africa with other countries. In other words, as Siraj has pointed out, we created the framework within which South Africa does the kind of racial science. We also collected a lot of documents, objects, human remains. We have an obligation and a responsibility to return these. But this idea of reparations and restitutions doesn't start now. So in the paper that the director of the Mali Museums and myself have, or are writing about these kinds of issues, we make the point. It starts to a parliamentary memorandum way back in 2003. It is not taken seriously until now. Siraj mentioned the kind of work that Ezekiel Museums have done, and they've done this also in an international context with the Commonwealth Association of Museums. And that forms part of the historical framing of reparations and restitution. What is interesting about the South African policy, it comes out around 2023, I think, or 22, 23, on reparations and restitution, is that it ignores all of that. It doesn't mention the Savoy report, which is absolutely essential. That's what frames the debates in Europe and in the US and elsewhere in the world. It doesn't mention it at all. It doesn't mention the memorandum in 2003. It doesn't mention that Ezekiel Museums, to which the relevant government departments in South Africa were invited and participated, ignores it. This is quite important because it goes to this point about how the state sees reparations and restitution. And this idea about it being an event. And you have a tent, you invite a whole lot of people, you make nice speeches, and that's where it begins. And that's easy because all it means is that you're transferring cultural items or bodies from one place to another place, from one country to another. So, I've also, as you've heard, been involved in various kinds of research projects. One of them is the Modern Heritage of Africa. It's motivated by the idea that there is only one modern heritage site in the whole of Africa, and that's in Asmara. And it's a result directly of Italian colonization and directly of Italian architectural design. If you're in Asmara, you will see it's in your face. But what they don't want to recognize is that the foundations for most of those buildings go back to the 12th century. And the team that was involved in getting it to be a World Heritage Site made a big issue around this, but it was dismissed. And so the influence of the Italian colonization is precedent over the indigenous foundations upon which the whole of Asmara is built. There are three principles that emerge from these documents. The SARS Savoy report, the Cape Town document, 2022, and the recent Nairobi recommendations of 2 weeks ago. And there are three very important there. There's a whole lot of stuff. Yes, some of it is, I think, some prints have been left out here in the front if people want. You get that. There are three important things. One is the right to claim. We've heard that Siraj has already made this. But especially, how do local communities make that claim? We have to learn very hard how those claims are made and how to counter the way in which it is framed in Europe, but actually all over the world. My work involves what they call movable objects, whether these are human beings or whether these are cultural or historical objects. It's important to recognize that these are movable. You can't move buildings. You can, but strictly speaking, that's not going to happen. And we have to recognize what must be returned that is part of the national estate. What belongs to the public of particular countries. So this offers the framework I'm suggesting as to how we go. It is, as Siraj was suggesting, how do we center human dignity? How do we center what some people call the natural human rights that are embodied in every single one of us across the globe? And what may be the role of restorative justice? What is restorative justice for one community may be different from another. And we have to kind of recognize how this happens, because it's also open to manipulation. So, in the paper that you're writing, you talk about 4 possible kinds of restitution. Domestic restitution, that's within the country, that's taking place, so within the state of South Africa. Continental or global restitution, and repatriation and archives. So I'm not going to talk about human remains as we see everything. Okay. So the key question then is, for whom should this restitution or repatriation take place? And in the examples that I will give, the answer depends on who constitutes the community or the local. Who are the key, authentic, plural beneficiary communities? Because it's not always one. And how are cosmopolitan or Afro-cosmopolitan values, relational restorative justice, and institutional interests embedded in these processes? So we've heard already that there's a state, there are policies, there are protocols that have to be followed, but the state also has an obligation beyond that. There might be different communities that have claims. And how do we recognize this? So I'm going to talk about very quickly the liberation archives, in relation particularly to Fort Hare. I'm going to talk a little bit about artworks in relation to the Ifalethu Foundation. And if you have time, I will talk a little bit about UCT's restitution of human remains found in its medical faculty. which relate directly to the way in which medicine was originally conceived in this country in terms of racial science. But before I do that, there was just two things. One, we did engage, South Africa did engage in reparations. They returned the Namibian archives, about 1,500 linear meters of it, which was located not too far from here, in part of them in Port Elizabeth, others in Pretoria. So that was done. But a more interesting example is much more recent, and that is the return of the Egyptian mummy that has been in the Durban museums. And it stands in this ambiguous position of between reparations and restitution, because officially it's beyond the millennia of restitution. But here again, this kind of local state, the Durban municipality with the national government, engaging with the Egyptian state as to how this happens. And again, it's very unclear how it arrived in the Durban museums, because the person involved in it, a Major W.J. Mayers, was involved in what they might have called pacification in Egypt, basically colonizing Egypt. And he collected items related to what was known as Egyptology and took it with him. And he gave it to his school, Eton School in the UK. How it gets into the Durban Museum is unclear. There's a project there. Anyway, when it was, at some point, this debate about reparations and restitution takes place within the Durban Museum, they recognize that it must be returned. Some arguments were made, some arguments were made about it must be kept because it's been looked after very well in the Durban museums, and we're doing all this wonderful stuff with it. We have reconstructed it, we've done this modeling, we've used the latest digital information, and it should remain there. Now, the SAR report is very clear. There are over 500 different kinds of museums in the whole of the continent, and most of them can do this kind of work. There will be a few that can't. But being able to maintain, preserve, and conserve museological items, objects, is not impossible. And so that kind of argument was dismissed. The more interesting argument was, no, it must be returned, and it will be returned according to press reports for the end of this year or early next year. They had digitized, recorded, made a movie, and that is what they will keep in the museum. But it raises a number of other issues which we have to be very aware of. So who has the rights to that digitization? Do we know exactly what the provenance of this Egyptian mummy is? Who owns the narrative around who this Egyptian mummy was? Well, we know it was. It was a priest, a minor priest that came from Egypt. Where is the ethics around the memory of this priest? And to what extent does this meet the criteria of the new museum definition, which places an ethical responsibility on museums to interact with the communities around them and internationally? So this is not something that can easily be dismissed. By the way, there's a mummy in one of the museums. Okay. The vote here. So, into a lot of detail here, but one of the debates around the Fort Hare archive, the National Liberation Archives, it's about bringing the archive of the national liberation movements from outside the country back into the country. So it started with the ANC, but the debate was, is it political organizations archives or is it a national archive? It was very important. There was a serious debate around this. It was eventually settled that this is a national archive. It must promote inclusivity. It must show that the approaches of these different liberation movements, I mean, we all know that they wanted to do liberation, but what was underlining their ideas of liberation? This is quite important because the idea of liberation, particularly looking at it from an African and an African diasporic point of view, is much wider than simply the idea that we must be liberated from colonization. So this goes back to what are the ideas that informed the Haitian Revolution before the French Revolution, or more or less at the same time. So this is quite critical because the scholars in the Caribbean are asking this question. It is an epistemic question, as Siraj has mentioned. What informs the idea of liberation? Is it just when this wave of democracy took place in Africa in the 1980s, is it just simply elections? Or is it more than that? So we have to ask this kind of question. And just talking about this question around international and the Irish, there are scholars in Ireland that are now tracing the earliest British colonization of Ireland way back to the 12th century. So it's not something recent. They are reflecting not only on what colonization meant for them, they're also reflecting on their own complicity in British colonialism. So the Irish wing of the British Army, what did they do in different parts of the world? What did various ambassadors do? What did Salawi do in Cape Town? He was Irish. Okay. So this is the kinds of questions that we have to ask. It means interrogating much more this question around what do we mean when we say we want justice? Right? We've already heard that it's not just about the money, it's more than money. When we talk about solidarity, are we also talking about questions of freedom, of equality, or equity? Or are we saying that freedom is just about the individual and solidarity is about something else? And is there a contradiction between what we mean by solidarity of a community which is not necessarily synonymous with the public interest? We have to ask these. These are difficult questions. We have to confront them. Because if we don't, the state will do exactly what Siraj said. They will do the event, and that's it. Nothing else. Okay. So that was underpinning a lot of the why liberation. But a lot of South African art left the country during the apartheid days. And we weren't able to acknowledge that. So in the early 2000s, the idea was that they would create a special vehicle called the Faletu Foundation. And they would be the means by which they bring back the art into South Africa. A lot of art left through diplomatic channels. Sometimes people carried it out. These were people who were thinking that they were doing a good thing, and it was at the time. I forget the full name of the person. Harrison, there's an artist called Harrison who painted the Black Christ. And if you see it, you'll understand why the South African state at the time, the apartheid state, would want to have burned it. So, Romney has. Okay. Got it. But only, as I've mentioned, put on there, 320 works from 11 countries were returned. And the money then ran out. So there's a lot of stuff still outstanding. The two points I would have liked to have made about this, and one is that it could have worked somehow with international organizations. ICOM, the International Council of Museums, they have a red list that could be activated. ICOM does a lot of work in this field, and this could have also have been activated. But I want to talk a little bit about, next slide please. I want to talk a little bit about the work that South African artists do, especially those that went into exile. Jumili Feni, whose work now is scattered between Fort Hare and the Constitutional Hill in Johannesburg, does this piece of work called, based around Picasso's Guernica work. And that comparison is compelling, and it is often made. So, I wanted to get what I wanted to say across very clearly, and so I'm going to read from my text. So, reflections of Jumili Feni's African Guernica reveal the layered complexity of interpreting struggle art beyond reductive comparisons to Picasso. While both works confront themes of violence and oppression, but if it stops there, it's conceptually lazy. Femi's piece engages with the legacy of coloniality, interrogating the intersection of modernity, tradition, and systemic domination. Unlike the often sanitized reading of Picasso's Guernica, this, which overlooks, by the way, often in Picasso's work, that the bombardment of the towns during the beginning of Franco's regime begins this new approach of warfare. Bombing whole towns. Doesn't that sound familiar today? But it happened. Vietnam, Cambodia, what else? It starts in Spain. There's the Second World War. There's the atomic bomb, which is very similar. Then there's Korea, Iran, Bosnia, and so on. But in Feni's work, the symbolism, the grotesqueness, particularly the three-legged towards the sort of, I guess, the right side of his work. He uses this three-legged figure quite often in his work. Sometimes it's like this, kind of grotesque, and other times it's about curiosity and looking forward. And it's this that I am arguing, that it's not just about bringing the artwork back. We need to begin to engage with this at a much more fundamental level. Okay. Just a few remarks. The UCT's human rights restitution took them 6 years from the time that they rediscovered that they had unethical human remains. The 6-year process, there is a lot to reflect on in this process. It's done almost in absence of a formal legal policy framework. There is a lot of combustion, a lot of conflict between experts, archaeologists, historians, for example, there's a lot of dissension between the officially identified descent family and representatives of the Khoi, the San, and the Nguni communities, or their officials, the leaders of these. You don't even know what's going on behind that. So there's that. There are other stakeholders in this, including the state. Sometimes they are absent, sometimes they are there. It's a very unclear area. And it does mean that we need to clarify how we want to do the things that we want to do. Especially if you want to take an issue around justice and epistemology. How do we do this? It's very important. And that was, for me, one key outcome of this process. Another one was UCT has not reflected on the fact that crucial disciplines within the university system arise out of racial science. Biology. So it has forensic biology, but it makes no comment about what were the origins of it. It has a medical faculty, which is world-renowned, but it doesn't reflect on its origins, and it doesn't reflect what may be the institutional racism that still exists, doing the same things that they're doing since it first started, over and over and over. And so this is a kind of important long-term kind of thing that has to be done. I want to conclude now, and I think I've taken far more time than I should have. That is just to say, to summarize some of this, is that liberation history is important. It's not just a set of events that happen. We actually begin to think about it a lot more and link it to other kinds of liberation movements. South Africa is a sub-imperial state, or it was, and it needs to begin to acknowledge its complicity in colonial collective. There are going to be tensions between communities, within the state, various stakeholders. Let's not hide from it. Let's not think that the principles of Ubuntu are embedded. They're not. Let's work on that. And so, for me, particularly when I was dealing with the modern heritage of Africa, remember that? In those two conferences and many, many workshops, people presented not just from the African continent, but from elsewhere. China, Singapore, the Middle East, they all happen to be in some way connected with particularly British colonialism. The outcome of that colonial process has been what Achille Mbembe calls concatenations. It's been uneven, unequal, multiple, overlapping, layered, creolized, hybridized. It is how we think of the people without history. But today we have to recognize it within a planetary context. The planetary context is that climate change is here, and it affects us in very, very significant ways. How do we do sustainable development within that context? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Aid. I think one of the things I keep on hearing is the idea of memory. And as one from the business sciences, we talk about value. Funny enough, when we start talking about those assets, they start to hit intangibility. And we start talking about pricelessness, because it means that God actually creates a value. It's actually very difficult. And though then some themes came up about, well, if you have this so-called asset, what is your provenance? How did it get in? Was it via the door, the window, the chimney? How did it arrive? It definitely wasn't Father Christmas. And then, which is very interesting for us and our so-called decolonial debate, that epistemically, most of even our courses, I was thinking just going to say the social sciences, and I thought, oh, wait a minute, pharmacy is also involved. Then I thought the sciences are also in there. But we can't lie, it's also business. We also based a lot of our thinking and our doing of stolen thought. That's the word that you want to use. And I think it's showing that this idea of the restitution project is going to be ongoing. On that note, we're going to ask Pedro to really give us some of his thoughts on the human side of this.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you're well. I'm still awake. I am half awake. I hope I'm waking up. What I'm going to talk about is a publication. I've written it in the last 3 days. I don't think this is a final thought about pretty much anything that I'm going to say today. But I do hope it's food for thought, and I hope I can get some insights from all of you. We can get insights from each other to supplement whatever deficiencies may be present in my talk. So, the harm done to this continent by Europe is unspeakable, from slavery, colonialism, neocolonialism, and so on. And much harm has been subsequently perpetrated by the harmed. Fanon speaks about this in his last 2 books. But what's the point of discussing reparations if it almost certainly isn't going to happen in any way that can possibly undo the past and make things right again? Rather than reparations understood as payment in some form for irreversible wrongs done, perhaps we should refine our demands and, more generally, our approach to help heal the wounds passed down for 8 eons and reopen continuously by powerful nations, often former colonial powers, insatiable extractionist hunger, and the global patterns of consumption that foster the increasing and seemingly endless need for finite resources and cheap labor in places where availability of cheap labor is largely the legacy of centuries of extraction of colonies. Reparations, or what ought to take their place, cannot be understood as undoing centuries of harm. That's not the way we can't undo. What's done is done. Some may entertain the impossible fantasy, but such fantastic meanderings are pathological. I'm not speaking of present harms, which must be addressed, but of all that has happened since conquest and enslavement. What was lost in the past remains lost in the past. The question is what to do now. Perhaps we should aim to help change the relationships between the oppressor and those harmed by them. But this is a very different matter from straightforward reparations, typically of a financial sort, although it may involve them. Perhaps, but how are we going to get this right? I ask this question and I offer no clear response. I'm proposing here, in a very schematic form, a forward-looking process rather than a backward-looking reparative work. That is payment for harms done by aggressors wanting to expiate themselves, or more cynically, to prepare the ground for more extraction. Biko and Fanon point out that you can't get the oppressor to save you. Salvation does not happen like this, for the wretched of the earth must activate their essential dispositions to achieve liberation. Dependency on the savior, typically the group that caused the harm in the first place, is precisely the sort of mentality that must be done away with if the oppressed are to find help. Reparations alone cannot achieve this. and I'm thinking mainly of financial reparation, not the sort of that my panelists have been sharing very insightfully today, not at all. The Jews who founded and are perpetuating the state of Israel in its current form chose an alternative response to oppression. They radically rejected dependency and went for a version of exclusionary autonomy that in effect amounts to genocidal racism, which is damaging their humanity in addition to the humanity of their neighbors, and damaging my humanity to some extent as well. Their use of the yellow star at a recent UN meeting reduces past suffering to cheap occasions to propagandize. This lack of respect for the millions who perished in the showers and the gas vans or were executed by more conventional means speaks to the self-dehumanization of Israel's Jewish population and the diaspora that supports their actions out of a twisted form of solidarity, which I don't share. The choice should go beyond, and pardon my French, nobody will fuck us over again, hubris, case of Israel, a case of the previous oppressed becoming oppressors, and losing the right to claim victimhood by using the rhetoric of victimhood to perpetuate the cycles of iniquity, such as those that led to the Holocaust, and the perpetuation of dependency by other means, the hope that the former oppressor or the former oppressor who is currently extracting the continent's resources will become a benevolent benefactor moved by guilt. I can't see that the continent can do anything to leverage the pressure required for squeezing funds or some other form of compensation out of former colonizers and enslavers, at least not at the scale with which Germany paid the Jews for their suffering. Indeed, in what sense is a reparation reparative? Some things can't be made right again. This, I think, needs to be ignored. The past can't be undone. We only have the present and future potentialities. And yes, there is something to be said about self-determination rather than trying to get others to help pull Africa out of the hole it is in. But the topic is vast, and I wonder how much can be gained from dealing with it at a very general level. I don't know how much more I can say that moves beyond trite generality. My mother, incidentally, receives funds from Germany as a victim of the Holocaust. I can't see that she still receives money. If you want to know, $1,500 every 3 months. I can't see that the billions Germany must have spent on compensating Jews for their suffering has done much more than relieve Germans of their bloodshed, if indeed it has done this. I'm far from convinced that it has indeed, or indeed that it should. My mother gets money, sure, but it has not done much to change her life and has certainly not made things right. Nothing can bring back the dead. That's an immovable limit against which struggle is futile. I'm not sure how much funding, such as what my mother continues to receive, helps the victims of genocide. I'm unsure what Germany should have done to make things right, because things cannot be made right. What Germany can do, however, is work to dispel prejudice responsible for its rankings of humanity, expressed by how it uses its money to compensate people for harms done. Compare the support given to the Herero Nama over a century after the massacre with the money which Germany continues to pay Holocaust survivors. Can things be made right in cases such as colonialism, enslavement, looting, and genocide? Maybe not. Maybe this is the wrong way to think about things. But isn't the point of reparation to make things right, at least at a symbolic level? Brief comments on the responsibility of victims. That's just a little section. The general point I am about to make is informed by the principle of consistency. If you are harmed and claim that this harm is unjustified, then you cannot consistently turn around and harm others. This is a simple formula, which is only violated if one can keep the horns of the dilemma from confronting each other. In the case of Israel, the horns are kept apart by prejudice. The formula is simple. The Holocaust is an affront against the Jewish people who have a special right over others, namely the Palestinians. The harm done to us, consequently, is of another order. To make this strange formula work, you need to establish a ranking of humanity. In that case, you can claim victimhood and be an aggressor without the discomforting of inconsistency. Rats, after all, can die in the millions, and nobody needs to give it a hand. That is the logic. But it's the same logic that Nazis used to justify their genocidal zeal. The only difference from the perspective of the state of Israel, however, is that the Nazi ranking was wrong. They put the wrong humans at the bottom. Get rid of the ranking, and the horns will confront themselves in all their raw crudity, and Israel will not be able to hide reality from itself. In the case of Jews, myself included, I think the harm done to them is significantly responsible for the mess in the Middle East. And that is perhaps a consequence of not coming to terms with something like people's call to stop the neurosis that was destroying black life in South Africa, a cure that also involved overturning white supremacist apartheid. But not only this, it is also arguable that the Afrikaner, brimming with resentment against the British atrocities committed against them, had their symbolic revenge in the form of apartheid. It seemed also to be motivated by the nobody will fuck us over again mentality, which is unavoidably dehumanizing. One of Biko's central insights was that only the oppressed can cure themselves and find a way to liberate themselves from their material and psycho-existential shackles. The secondary insight is that only oppressors, who typically grasp themselves as victims, can cure themselves. In one case, the oppressed grasp themselves as needing to be saved by the oppressor, and in the other, the nobody will fuck us over again principle applies. A third alternative is required here, the restoration of humanity. That's a very vague, general, hopefully evocative direction. It's foggy. We can beef it up with a bit more thinking. The point of the above digression into the responsibilities of victims is that we should not separate our reparation demands from a clear understanding that despite distorting pressures due to power abuses, only the oppressed can cure themselves. I can't send someone else on my behalf to a psychologist to deal with my own neurosis. I must go, confront my demons, and find a way of regaining health. I'm not advancing a case against reparations, by the way. I am instead inviting a more nuanced understanding of reparations than the crude, you harmed us, so you must owe us for me. Whatever version of reparation you choose, it must be forward-looking, and this cannot be separated from work on itself. I'm inviting us to think more broadly about what is required to make things right, when nothing can change what has come to pass. And my suggestion, a suggestion I make hesitantly, is that thinking about the role of reparations within a much broader liberation framework, to think about that role, the role of reparations, within a much broader framework. Some reparation is useless. In the case of my mother's German guilt allowance, and perhaps helps Germany feel better about itself when it shouldn't. The inconsistency of Germany's reparations when considering the Hiroshima and the Jews attest to ongoing white supremacy, the negation of black lives in Europe, by Europe. This points to the fact that Germany still has much to learn. And it is perhaps, in the first instance, white supremacy that we should be fighting against, rather than being compensated by white supremacists. To make things right when the past cannot be undone is, in the first instance, I suggest, following Fanon and Biko again, involved changing the relationships that help perpetuate the evils of the past and their contemporary configurations. This may indeed involve reparations, but the reparations must be understood as one aspect of a far more fundamental project, the project of humanization. Since material conditions shape minds for good or ill, we must move beyond the you owe us mentality to an ongoing effort to humanize relationships. There is no magic bullet that will save us from our predicaments, and merely throwing money at problems will not do. The issue is much deeper, richer, and I suggest more interesting than asking transgressors to pay a fine and leave things like that. Consider Canadian and Australian indigenous populations. Money and land has been thrown at them, or taken from them and thrown, fix it, don't have that, for decades. But little will change until the oppressors cease to be oppressors. The oppressor who offers alms continues the cycle of humiliation. Thanks.
Thank you for that, Pedro. I kept on wondering why I was being taught Shakespeare. And it comes out to me now that there's a sense of out damn stand that Lady Macbeth is trying to remove. And I think the sense we're getting is that yes, you could possibly want to try and wash that blood away with a bit of money, but the issue is that action has already occurred and it needs to fix the people. So I think that is a very, very, very telling point. We're still good on time. I was hoping to see if we can take some questions, and I'd also love them to engage in questions together with it. So we've got a little bit of time. With my team here on the roving mic, they want to see if they can get some. So are any hands ready with it? I see a hand there, I see two, I see three. Okay, let's manage this now. Let's take that first three for now, and then I've noted this side. So I will come back to this side. There's no new entrance. So I saw one in the overall, and then there was that side. Then sorry, just to identify that way. That's how it is. Okay. But brevity is the mark of a man. I would say that again. Brevity is going to be very, very important, so that it allows all of us to engage. So warning for everyone. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening. I'm a visitor in Makanda from Wapata. I came here to prepare for my National Arts Showcase, and then also, to get involved with Makanda activities and whatsoever. So that's why I decided also today, mashallah, I should come. So it was nice to hear that there's a lot of movement that is happening based on the museum side of things and other things that are related to African things that have been stolen and not returned back. So it is good. It is great that we have this kind of events happening more time. Our contribution from the companies that I represent the Creative Arts Embassy, which is in the Eastern Cape, in Wapapa, a school which we just kickstarted, which deals with development in terms of skills development and diplomatic development, and also cultural representation of who we are. Where I'm from, our kingdom is, our language is not known mostly by other South Africans, but we are also South Africans. So we are still trying to get to that point where we can express ourselves. So it will be really nice for you guys to kind of collaborate with us also, as you are on the same journey as us, to see how far we can venture in explaining the years that have been lost in the African history. As we know, the last 500 years has been just trauma. Every time we try to go back, tell a story that is like 500 years back, it's just trauma. When we go 500 back, it's trauma. Now with the story that I just brought in, Makanda is there. It's a story that tells a story about 5,000 years ago. It's the same thing of the mummies and stuff. So I hope to see you there. I hope to engage with you while I'm still in Makanda. Very nice. Very nice guys.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Edward Shabanala. I'm a political traditional religious studies student. So today, as much as we engaged with these materials that have been presented to us today about restoration of or bringing back the objects that have been stolen to Africans and celebrating the month of Africa. And then I have some few questions that, as much as endeavors whereby we have to engage with these restorations and be able to have such dialogues and conversations, is that I think personally there's nothing much deeper that has been done, or so much energy that has been given to the materials that we study or the discourse in which that we engage with said materials. For example, I was very much bored in one of my anthropology class first term this year when we were doing biological anthropology and social anthropology, where I get to see that we have been studying for the very longest time, depending on the essentialist theories, most of the structuralist theories like Charles Darwinism, and all those theories that such materials that have been taken to us have been actually taken to actually justify the objectification of those materials and those scientific research that have been done. But so I wish to call that as much as we engage in these conversations, we also pay attention to the discourse, because discussively, the discourse is not doing much. For example, the curriculum that you are studying, we have been taught of these theories and these theories, but there is no ethnographic or research that is enough and materials that are enough locally to actually contribute and change the way in which that we articulate and change the way in which that we see these things that are happening around us and everything that is happening in this state.
Thank you so much.
Good evening. My name is QI, and I'm a science student, but I'm also just a bit interested in the history side of things. My question is also on the cultural stuff that need to be returned to the nations of origin. Well, I come from Zimbabwe, and there were some birds, soapstone birds that were in the Great Zimbabwe, and they were also taken out of the country at some point, and then with the country gaining independence, they fought to also get those things back in the country. And now, I was just looking at, for example, the things like those mummies and how important maybe they are to the nation of origin. As Africans ourselves, if we take that initiative to just maybe respect each other's heritage, for example, if there are things that are in Durban and Egypt is there, it's also part of Africa, can they just also take up an initiative as African states themselves to return such things to each other? I think it would be, we don't really need to fight a lot with maybe those kind of things outside our continent to help us to solve our own issues. And then another thing I was just looking at also is sometimes when there are reparations, we talk about the financial part of things, and then there were some business magnates, for example, with Rhodes, your Alfred Bate. These are people who actually gained a lot from Africa. And yes, there are some certain trusts, like the Bate trustees and the Rhodes Trust, that are also involved in a lot of call them charitable things, or I'm not so sure the best word to use for that. But my question on that is, with also the financial reparations that we are looking at, and because when you look at, for example, the Rhodes scholarships and all those things, yes, they do help to some extent the African states, but you look at most of the people that are actually responsible for even returning or helping the African people, most of those things they are in Oxford, most of those guys. So can't we then have our own, or if this thing can be more localized rather than having people who are outside handling the resources that were taken out from here, rather than like having those resources back here and being here. Thank you, sir.
As you've seen, there's some commentaries and questions. Maybe let's tackle them. But I warn you, because your presentation eats away from the next group's presentation. You guys not taking you?
Well, I just, general, just, I think about the money stuff, there's no, you know, the money can come back, that's fine. But you can be a millionaire and still have, be messed up, right? Still have the scars going on, you still feel like you're not, you know. We have so many examples in social media of these people who are trying to compensate. And so I would be cautious that not to reduce the problem to a problem of the flow of money. What I do think is absolutely imperative, and I think this is something that I think the three of us have in common, which is that from very different approaches, right, is a kind of, what we need is a shift in the symbolic order. And so how you do that is by thinking very carefully about the gestures that we do. So the gestures of bringing things back isn't just because these objects are mine and they're stolen. It has to do with reclaiming something and about reconfiguring, right, the symbolic order that informs our own lives during this conflict. I think that's the sort of, it seems to be the fundamental thing. And so money might be part of the story, but I would be very wary not to see that as the main part of the story. And I certainly would be very careful not to ask for alms, right? That seems to just perpetuate the problem. What you can do is engage in activities that will have a transformative effect. I'm not going to recommend this in fact, I'm very critical of it in many ways. But when Fanon engaged in revolutionary violence, he understood that he needed to transform the symbolic order in order to transform the mindsets of individuals. I think that went wrong in many ways. Algeria is still a dictatorship. It's been there for a long time. There's a lot of killing, a lot of torture going on, inspired by the French, even after the French left, etc., etc. But what I think is interesting about that move is the understanding of what I would like to call symbolic order, or the poetic, the way in which we reconfigure our own understandings of ourselves through the gestures that have been suggested here today. I think that's what most people have. I don't know if that.
Yeah, I mean, just to add to that. So, for example, the Nairobi recommendations very strongly center community. I mean, we can have a debate about what we mean by community. But essentially what they are saying is this: we don't want things like money and resources to be centralized in the state. We want this to filter down in a way in which changes the nature of the way we understand both ourselves, our past, and our future. That is what is essential about restitution. And if you combine it with the question around what do we mean by reparation in meaningful resource terms, then you have to think about that. In other words, money going to elites within the state is not going to help our sense of how restitution should be taking place.
One of the things that's very difficult for us to grasp is the extent to which we have inherited a complex and contradictory legacy that constitutes democratic South Africa. We have inherited a set of legacies of having been victims of colonialism, not just a singular but multiple colonialisms. But unfortunately, we have also inherited a legacy of South Africa being a colonial overlord, being the colonizer of Namibia, and having, if you like, a colonial-like relationship with Zimbabwe, Botswana, and other societies. And the presence of the birds in the South African presidency and Ezekiel is fundamental to sorting out these legacies of colonialism. The archival restitution that was done during the time that Paulo Gordon was certain kind of precedent that needs to be followed through. And we are very pleased that our colleagues from the Museums Association of Namibia and our colleagues from Physical Museums of South Africa have been talking to each other quite seriously and preparing the way for restitution, because our colonial legacy has a complicatedness that comes from multiple colonialisms, and it comes from having been a settler colony and what that means. And so the symbolic nature of what those restitutions are going to mean, how we remake our relationship with Namibia, with Zimbabwe, with Mozambique, is going to be fundamental to our process.
Thank you so much. I think I'm particularly enamored by the sociology, anthropology student who's in final year. And I find that fascinating. I think that's a compelling question. I think that would be a makings of an excellent academic career. Where do you find this material? Where do you find the things that we use that represent us, that talk about us? I think that's a fight that we're not going to win easily anytime soon, and you must keep it going. As I'm saying, we don't have answers for you. We're hoping that you're part of the solution. You know, stay to it. I'm noting, I saw some hands this side. I see 1, 2, what was that? That's what I want to say. I want you to share in there. Okay, now I'm conflicted. Okay, what do we do this? Let me take 1, 2, and I'm going to drift that side 3. Okay, let's do that. The standing orders apply.
Thank you very much. I wonder if I'm audible, but I'm going to try, because this conversation is what really interests me. Thank you so much. I acknowledge and I notice our Vice Chancellor. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. Thank you to the panelists. Very interesting conversations. When the student of anthropology was asking a question, I was saying to myself, what amount of Africa is sitting where? And I was thinking about these anthropologists, the Orona Marshalls and whatever, these ones from a time immemorial. I lived and studied in Norway, and I can tell you stories of what anthropologists have done to Africa. This is not colonialists, a different form of people who came in. And the question that I have to all of you is, with the picture that you have given us, what is Africa's posterity in terms of our history and legacy? If the situation is as you say, what is inside Africa for posterity? That's what I want to hear from all of you. And then the first professor, Dr. who was presented as Shahid, and I think it was the first one, we said that the country is reduced to events. And I was saying precisely, this is another event. Yeah. But again, we have academic freedom, and thank God that we have, and thank God that you came here. But indeed, my question that is begging for me is, what is the role of the academics? That the student who is speaking there is communicating really directly with me. What are the academics doing? What are we doing when we see this void? We always tell our students and ourselves as members of the academia that we're filling the gap. Are we filling the gap?
There's something Prof. Shahid spoke upon with tensions, specifically rising in the different societal levels in society,
much for sharing some very fascinating insights. Mine is an intervention whilst I try to grapple with the insights that you've provided in terms of providing some kind of methodology in terms of how to go about the processes of repatriation and restorative justice. It comes across for me as a rather exotic exercise in the sense that maybe I'm too much influenced by, I'm a class system historian, the background in terms of my theoretical framings. Those who are familiar with Jacques Derrida's archive theory, I see a challenge in terms of what Derrida calls a delocalizing impetus. If the collections in terms of artifacts that were taken from Africa to the global north, if we do take them again back into Africa in the name of restoration and so on, we really run the risk of perpetuating this, delocalizing, problem, because if we think in terms of Paul Virilio, see theory of politics, space, and speed, we would never come to a point where we would agree that the place from which perhaps some human remains were exhumed, if you look at it, maybe how many years, 100 of years afterwards, that place no longer exists. That space is not contiguous with O2. The spaces that were made and remade after the exercise itself. And also things in terms of modern sovereignty. And here I'm informed by the argument of Negri and Hart in terms of the theory of the empire. The empire has never ended. We are sort of, it's a wild goose chase, because if we bring the artifacts, if we bring the remains of the dead, Africans from the global north into some museum back in Africa, the infrastructure and the knowledge system that tries to make sense of all this is still influenced by empire. And I would like your intervention in terms of the methodology, because I see ourselves, or the way you are trying to put it across, is rather counterfactual, counterintuitive, because it doesn't really make sense to me in terms of the kind of methodology informing, even from the beginning, the idea of decolonization itself. I don't think those things are practically possible. I'm very pessimistic about it.
Thank you so much. Let's see.
Thanks for the great question. I'll start with the last comment. I think the idea of us being the product of both, colonized people, right, should help us. And another thing that I think is important is you cannot extract yourself from your historical position. You've been shaped. All of us have been shaped by our positions. We can't get rid of it, right? So who we are now, and I think that speaks to the second question, who we are now, right, who we're going to be in the future is a function of what we are now. And we can't erase what we are now. What we are is we've been shaped by the world, by the history, by everything that's happened to us. We cannot erase that. Right? So that's part of it. But what I think is important and what I think is interesting, and I don't know that this is incompatible with Derrida, is not that you can kind of erase and get yourself out of it, but you can reconfigure it. You can start to work on the way in which things, on the meanings, right? So I think fundamentally the three of us have been talking about the transformation in the meaning of the space of the world that we live in. And that we can do. And I think we cannot understand the problem. What they're doing, right, is only one aspect of a very much bigger project. It cannot be reducible to that, and it certainly can't be the case of bringing nice artifacts to feed, so that those in power can celebrate and tell us how awesome we are and that that Africa is regaining it. That's not the story. My sense is even the accounts that I was hearing is that you have to think very carefully about what you do with these artifacts. You don't just bring them back and put them in another museum. You have to do something else with them. You have to do something that is respectful and will actually help, well, firstly heal, but also start to transform the symbolic order. And I don't see that that's incredible there. About universities and their complicity, I couldn't agree more. I think we need to think way out of the box when it comes to how we think about education, way out of the box. And I don't think we're doing anything. And so I think the question of the gentleman at the back, which you addressed, is very pertinent. We have to. I would not want to turn this into a what is it? A kind of let's burn all books that are written in the West. That's not what we want. But we certainly don't want to kind of be privileging what happens over there, as opposed to what we can produce and what we have. I think that needs to be brought in. We need to think very carefully about that. So, but I also think we need to do a lot more than that. I mean, that's a long story. I mean, why are lecture theaters designed like this? What does that mean about the nature of authority, about how we should be thinking about knowledge? There's so much I would love to talk to you that it's not going to happen.
Just some really great questions and challenges and provocations that are challenges for us. For me, to think about what the challenges are of imagining African societies outside of the terms of colonialism. And sometimes when we do what we think is liberatory thinking, we inadvertently sometimes reproduce colonial thinking. I found myself somewhere in the last couple of days where a project wanting to project different African countries and their characteristics, how we must pay attention to them, also spoke about African people in ethnic groups. These are the African ethnicities. So for me, we need to be able to think about Africanness and indigeneity outside of colonialism in the multiple ways in which our Africanness was constituted, so that we don't have a singular apartheid concept of Africanness that is racialized, essentialized, and left in the apartheid categorization of South Africa that then transmogrified almost seamlessly into a politics of diversity after 1994, of a rainbow nation, each in their discrete, separate racial categories, now spoken of as indigenous, without any sense of colonial formation. So we need to be able to think about that. And we also need to move away from the singular concept of the academy. We have such a diverse academy in South Africa and the world. I'm at the University of the Western Cape. I was formed as an undergraduate student under a permit in a white university. I recognize what that did to me. I recognize what it did to have been formed under apartheid. But I'm also a creature of the mass movements of the 1980s, where my formation took place. So we're not just singular. We don't just, in fact, I think acting out of the identification of just being an academic, I think is extremely limiting. Because one of my main projects work that I've done, work that I've published with my colleague Leslie Witz and Gary Hinckley, has been about removing authority from the academy and placing it in the public domain, so that publics are not constituted as grateful recipients of academic knowledge, but are producers of knowledge themselves. And, you know, equally, we need to be able to think of restitution not just as event of a geographic movement from a museum in one place to a museum in another place. This is epistemic work that involves thinking about the objectifying category of human remains, which is the term of biological anthropology, and understanding what happens when Ezekiel took ancestral remains out of their collection. That space needs to be governed by communities and descendants, not by the museum. That is how you turn. That's how you go through a project of rehumanization, which is the methodology that we came up with during the return of the remains of glass and protein. Restitution will most likely not happen from museum to museum. It is not just a rearrangement of museum governance, because what we are talking about is fundamentally changing what we mean by museum. So that museum is not the government of collections. Museum is in fact constituted out of restitutionary work, because this is the age that we are in.
I think for me, it's such an interesting thing from anecdotally having come to Grahamstown in '89, still during apartheid, and being in a white school, and then hearing about watching Mandela get released while you're there, and then you suddenly get retold the story of apartheid. But this is my point. My point is, we also don't want to run the danger of reductionism, because what people keep doing now is keep saying, no, because now we're economically emancipated, we've done nothing. Nothing has been achieved. Nothing is there yet. We've heard the opening statements of places that are in conflict now, where they're actively and they're shedding blood as they're doing it. And I think there's a lesson in what we've done. And I'm not promoting South African exceptionalism, because I believe that's nonsense, right? But I think there's something that we did well then that other people can learn from us, right? About not getting into a situation that's volatile and leading to bloodshed. And I mean, let alone the fact that even now we've changed governments bloodlessly. So this narrative about economics first, the rest shall follow, is quite dangerous, because it removes us as a people. It forgets about us and what we're trying to do. I'm conscious of time. I'm going to listen to Madam Chair there, co-chair, or maybe I'll take one or two and then we... Yes, please.
So the issue that unites all of these is, how do we refashion our futures? Let's ask that question. Not how do we do the same that the colonists have done, or how they have constituted their imagination of the world. How do we refashion that? That to me is the question to ask yourself. And you can use whatever is the fashion on the left bank, but localize it here.
I'll take a hand, one or two, that's it. And they need to be very quick and brief, because I will be interrupting the view. Once we're now talking about the basic needs, and I'm interrupting. I don't want to be that guy.
Sorry. Oh, thank you so much for that. Pedro, my impulse is to disagree with you. And I think it's how the positioning of, but I hear the idea of the importance of the of the symbolic order, right? So I think that's what you take me back in terms of what the role of money. Because I don't know if $1,500 does nothing for your mother. I know a lot of people whose lives will be changed by $1,500 often. So I think abject poverty and systemic poverty has a role to play where money becomes a very bread and butter issue for people and their livelihood. I'd like to ask the panelists whether there's an example of some model that's worked, or the closest that we've seen examples around the world of whether it's a process of this nature where like actually these people, this process went quite far in something that we're imagining. I'd like to ask about whether the environment has ever been engaged, the rivers, the mountains, cleansing man. There's also a thing that I think environmentally, there's a political project, there's an economic project, there's a spiritual project, more. And I felt Prof. speak about it, Sherry, at the beginning, pointing us to how do we engage the matters of the soul when we are dealing with a political economic crisis of this nature that has changed the nature of our being. So it is about where the environment sits, is really the question, whether there's an example that we have that we can look at, and how we language this to the children, which is another kind of important thing for me. So how do we talk about this thing to children? Because part of what we're seeing now is a lot of discourse in the media. We're talking about there's this genocide, not the history of reparations, apartheid, the ability to now take apartheid crimes to court. What are we languaging to children about the process of restoring ourselves, and how do we do that?
So I think that, as we say, the thing is, exercise accountability, because otherwise, if I don't get it closed by his body, let's hear the response and then I'll see what I actually
I just don't think that it's just about money. It's not that there shouldn't be. And of course, my mother's middle class. She had a career. $1,000 something because it was for her. But an interesting thing, and it did help us, $500 that she got. She got $500 very early on in the 70s. That was actually the payout. This is like a pension. Weird. It's connected to all cost of. So she gets $500, which is a lot more money in those days. And my father was just starting his academic career. We had just moved to Brazil. We didn't have any money. Brazilians were very inefficient. We didn't have any money. It helped us have, rice on the plane to eat. So it did help. But it was like an insult. It was only $500. She lost 3 uncles. One aunt and 2 uncles. And father was in a concentration camp. She was in the ghetto. And she left it. What is that? Only 500 because you didn't leave Hungary immediately after the Holocaust. You left at 56. It's an amount of money. And if you think about the relationship, it's what's going on here. And if you're thinking about, it's a little bit like an underhand insult. And also, if you compare it with Herrero, Nama Herrero, and the little that isn't actually even the 1 billion euros that was very recently, more than 100 years after, given to the government of Namibia for projects, but not clearly compensation for the massacres, compared to what the Jews got. What's going on? So I think we need to think about those things, and we need to think. The relationship that I have with beggars is never going to be a good one. I give money to someone who's hungry. Yes, he needs the money. I give him a sandwich, whatever. It's not a good one. We don't want that sort of relationship. We want to go beyond that. So I agree. I'm agreeing with you. But of course, it would have helped tons of people more than it helped. Yet you Germany should give the money to people who didn't use it.
I've gotten a complaint from a law professor that we didn't want to cover matters of law. No, I'm not asking to speak, but it's just something that, colleagues, what I would like to also suggest is that the networking and the sustenance we put out there is also for networking. We want you to find a time and space to engage and do further so that there are more projects and there are more things. It's a nice grandstand and it's nice to put things in, but I find you might have a quieter word with someone and it'd be more meaningful in terms of that, on that. And on that note, I really would call upon the closing remarks and vote of thanks from Pope Patrice Kaleya, our Deputy Dean for Humanities, just to close it nicely for us there, while people are still thirsty for more.
Thank you very much, Taban. I'm going to ask everyone, please, let's give another round of applause. I have been asked to close, but this is to close the beginning. We are celebrating the African Day. This is the day for Africa. It happens to be the last day because we had a series of events, but this is the last event for this year. But it is the beginning because the nature of the debate that we have had here needs to be followed up. This is the night, and this is the time for those who love not only Africa as a continent, but most importantly, those who love Africans. The human side should come first. This is what we have heard from the panel. I have to thank Ola for organizing this event, starting for all the activities that has led to this day. Ola has worked so hard, and people have read whatever was written on the wall. Every sentence was very, very important. And every sentence was taken seriously by all the leaders who passed by the wall. Now, that was not enough until Ola was able to select this panel. Siraj, thank you very much for coming to Rhodes University. We appreciate your presence here. I met with Siraj at his institution. We worked together. That was 20 years ago. And I'm happy to see him here with us sharing this panel. Thank you very much, Siraj. Your insight is very important. I think our students have taken note of whatever you have said and for all the work that you are still doing at Zipo. Because we can't say that tonight it is about another inaugural, another talk show, but this is about a practical side of what we do as academics. For those who want to contribute to what we have heard about the returns, about the objectification, Siraj is here working at Zipo and Judapolis. Thank you very much. This is the only person I can say we need to bring back. Why am I saying this? Because I know Shahid is with us. He's not leaving tomorrow. Thank you very much for agreeing to be with us for a longer period of time. Your knowledge of archives and what you have explained to us tonight is very inspirational. I think our anthropology department and histories will come to you because you are still staying with us here in Makamba. Thank you very much. And for you, Pedro, this is the second time I'm meeting with you today, right? Pedro is with us here at Rhodes University, and he is quite provocative. You have heard his presentation. This means that you need to follow him in order to understand, because what he has said, it's just an introduction to what he can say. I was waiting for him to talk about, to bring Camus into discussion tonight. But he forgot, because he only spoke about Big O and Fanon. But I thought Camus was also appropriate for tonight, because I think he is a specialist of Camus. Thank you very much for that. And I have to thank also our Vice Chancellor for being with us until this time. This is the person who works very hard, but we are really grateful that until this time you are still with us tonight. And we thank you very much for your presence. And for all of you students, this is the night not to forget. We promise another good night coming forward. However, this is the beginning. If you have never heard about reparation, justice, this is the beginning, and please stick to it and work for that to succeed. And I have to thank you very much for everything. And I give the microphone to Taban again for him to invite us to something nice.
Guys, as you can see, we're a great team here. Don't forget about them. It's smooth, it's sailing. Thank you guys.